All right, everyone. Hi and welcome. My clock shows 6 o'clock, so let's just jump right into this presentation. First off, welcome. This is a Nevada Department of Wildlife Conservation Education program, so just a few little housekeeping things before we get totally into it. This is a family program, so please keep everything PG rated. We do have the chat box open as well as the question and answer box. So if you have any questions at all, make sure to throw them in the question and answer box, and we'll see if we can get those answered for you. This is also a Zoom platform. I cannot see you or hear you, so definitely if you have questions, throw them in that chat box or the question and answer box, excuse me. So tonight, we are talking about living with mule deer. And my name is Jessica Wolf, and I am the Urban Wildlife Coordinator for the Western Region for the Department of Wildlife. And with me tonight, I have Amanda Mulholland, and she is one of our AmeriCorps members. She's awesome. She is going to be monitoring the Q&A box in the chat, so she'll be answering any of those questions that you have. But if tonight you don't get your question answered, or in your dreams you come up with a answer or a question that you need answered, that is my phone number and my email address, and I'll also have those at the end, and you can always reach out to me with any questions that you might have. So with that, let's just jump right into it. So who are mule deer? Well, mule deer are the native species of deer in Nevada. They are in the family Cervidae, so that means that they have hooves and they have antlers that shed. Bucks range in weights from 150 to 200 pounds, and does are slightly smaller, weighing between 100 and 150 pounds. Still pretty big. And they'll live anywhere from 9 to 11 years. They are herbivores, and they need a soft, high-protein forage to survive. And they'll eat a variety of different things, from leaves and needles, succulent stems, fruits, nuts, shrubs, forbs, domestic crops, and grasses. I'm sure if you live in an area where there are plentiful amounts of mule deer, the population is nice and high, you'll notice them kind of coming into your neighborhoods and starting to eat some of those nice domestic crops we have. Their diets do change seasonally. So in the wintertime, they're really dependent on shrubs and trees, whereas in the spring and summertime, they're eating more forbs, and they depend a lot on grasses during the springtime. So they do have those shifts. And during the wintertime, one of the shrubs that they need the most is sagebrush and antelope bitterbrush, because they keep those nice green leaves throughout the year. So that's a really important food item for them during the winter time. So first, what are antlers? So only male mule deer have antlers, and they're actually made out of bone. And antlers fall off every year, and unlike horns will stay on the animal throughout their entire lifetime and keep growing, like in the case of the bighorn sheep. Horns are actually made out of two parts, a bony core and then a keratin sheath, so a sheath that kind of goes over the bony part. Antlers are just made out of bone, and they fall off each year. So this is kind of a picture of the growth pattern. This is not a mule deer, but you can see after the antler has fallen off in picture A, it kind of looks red and gross and kind of scabby. Well, it'll immediately start regrowing, and the fuzzy stuff in picture D, that's called velvet, and that's providing all the nutrients that make that bone grow. And then once the antler is fully formed, they scrub that velvet off because they no longer need it. And it kind of turns into a bloody, gory mess, as exhibited in picture F. But then that'll kind of turn into that nice, beautiful bone that we saw on the previous picture. And antlers, they're grown for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to gain access to does in order to mate and pass on their genetics. So here's just a brief look at mule deer through the seasons. From November to December, that's the rut, that's when it's their mating season. And male deer, they will fight over access to females. So they'll use those antlers and bang them together, and whoever wins will get access to that female or that herd of females. Then in late December through January, bucks will drop their antlers, but then basically immediately after that, they start regrowing them in February to March. They'll start regrowing those. Also in February through April, mule deer will migrate from winter ranges to summer ranges. So in the wintertime, you'll find mule deer hanging out down in lower elevations to get all of the food that's maybe not covered by snow, because the higher elevations, they have a lot more snow during the winter. And then they'll go back up to those summer ranges in the higher elevations to get all the delicious sprouts that are coming up during the springtime. From May through August, that's when they typically have their fawn. Does give birth after about 7 months of gestation, and this is when the does can be much more aggressive. They can be very protective of their young, especially with like pets or people trying to come up to both of them. So you definitely want to stay away. And then from August to whenever the snow accumulates, some mule deer will migrate back to their winter ranges in those lower elevations. So fawns, they are super, super adorable. They're born at about 7 months gestation or 200 days, and they're born both scentless and spotted. And those spots, they help them to camouflage in their natural environment to decrease predation. And then they're also born scentless so that predators cannot smell them. That's why it's really important, if you do see a fawn by itself, never touch it. They'll actually stay really still, and that's kind of an innate ability that they have while their moms go off and forage for food. And so we don't want to touch them and get any scents on them, because that leads them to be a little less protected from predators. So like I said, does will leave fawns for hours at a time to go forage, because a fawn, when they're born, they can be only about 5.5 pounds. So that's pretty tiny and definitely could not keep up with mom going off to forage. And finally, they're weaned at about 60 to 75 days old, and that's when they'll start to kind of lose those spots. So in Nevada, we only have mule deer. There are areas where mule deer and white-tailed deer habitats overlap, but Nevada is not one of those places. You can kind of tell the difference between mule deer and white-tailed deer from a few telltale signs. The first one is the mule deer. They have those big, gigantic mule-like ears. They're really large in proportion to their heads. Whereas the white-tailed deer, they do have smaller little ears. And I actually think they kind of look silly on them, comparing them to our mule deer ears. Mule deer have a rope-like tail that has a black tip. And white-tailed deer, they have a large tail that's all white when they flick them up. And they'll flick them up when they're startled or trying to go away from something. And then their antlers are also different. White-tailed deer, they have a main shaft with tines that go upward from that, whereas mule deer antlers, they kind of fork out. So why are they here? They are here for 4 main reasons. Number 1 is food, water, shelter, and space. And all of this creates their habitat. And we like to live in cities. Humans like to live in cities because they're super comfortable. We've got access to food through grocery stores, water from our pipes and our infrastructure, shelter from our homes and other buildings. And we've also made them really aesthetically pleasing by having local art and landscaping and so much more. Well, animals like those things too, especially urban animals, because they'll be attracted to things like food, and they can get those in the case of mule deer through our landscaping and our gardens that we put out. They'll find access to water from our fountains and our ponds and our bird baths, and they can even find shelter with the shrubs and the trees that we plant. And all urban wildlife, they have different ways of being able to live within our cities and our neighborhoods. These are just a few of the examples of what some animals might take advantage of in our backyards. But our cities, they also provide a lot of protection from predators as well. So here is just a few examples of some urban animals finding a little niche in our cities. This right here is a bobcat hanging out on a person's porch, finding lots of rodents and rabbits to eat, I'm sure. There's even a bird feeder back there that would attract rodents and small birds. This right here is a female sage grouse that is still, from my understanding, living in a neighborhood in South Reno. Kind of surprising, you wouldn't expect to see a sage grouse in the middle of a city, but there she is, hanging out, living her best life. She's been there for about a year or more. Bears, of course, are another urban animal that take advantage of a lot of resources that we have to offer. This one right here is taking advantage of a bird feeder that didn't quite have the ladder taken away in time. Coyotes, of course, are another one that are a very common urban animal that take advantage of lots of resources. This one right here is looking like it's getting a piece of a sandwich that someone maybe left behind. And then, of course, we have the deer that do love to live in our neighborhoods. So there are certainly a lot of ways that we can kind of try and prevent conflicts with these animals. So we'll get into a couple of those ways right now. So there are lots of different options out there, from motion sensor sprinklers to scent deterrents. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over what some of those options are and the benefits and maybe the downfalls of them as well. So the first one I wanted to talk about are motion activated devices. And some of the benefits of these are that they work for more than just deer, and there's lots of options available. There are motion sensor devices, there are light options, as well as sound options. And these, again, will work for lots of different animals that you're trying to get away, to go away, but there are some downfalls for them. If you're using the first one that popped up, this one right here, that's called a scarecrow. And that's a motion activated sprinkler. Not super great for the winter time, but during the spring and the summer when it's not going to freeze up, they're really cool. But you do need access to water when you're using them. Things like the sound devices, they can be a nuisance to neighbors depending on which sound you choose. And animals can also become habituated to them quickly. So you have to move them frequently to kind of lessen that. And the animal also does have to set off that sensor, which is a downfall because if they don't set it off, it's not going to work. But one study came out and was looking at the efficiency of noise-making devices, and they found that using the voice of a distressed doe actually helped to kind of lessen the amount of animals that were in the area, particularly deer. But with that, you might be attracting another sort of animal that you might not want in the area. If you're trying to protect a garden or ornamental plants, there are lots of taste deterrents on the market, as well as things that you might already have on hand, like Tabasco and different types of hot sauces. So these are awesome because they're relatively cost effective. And again, there are lots of different options out there. But they do have to be applied to a plant, so this isn't super great if you're trying to protect a garden space. I don't want hot sauce on my tomatoes. I'd like to make my tomatoes into hot sauce, but not put hot sauce on them before that. And then animals, again, can become habituated to them, and we'll get into a little bit more about what that means. They can also be short-lived when it comes to rain or snow. It'll remove it, so you have to continually reapply. But if it is for a short amount of time, these can work pretty well. And then the animal does still have to eat the plant in order to get that taste deterrent. There are also lots of odor deterrents. Again, cheap, often things you can find around the house, from Irish Spring soap to even human hair. And they're relatively easy to keep up with. But not all of these are scientifically backed, and they do lose their scent relatively quickly, so they do have to be reapplied often. Again, there's the issue of the animal becoming used to it, so habituated to it, and it no longer being effective. Odor deterrents typically are not my favorite thing to suggest to people just because I don't find them to be very effective and you do have to reapply them. It's also not known if the animals are actually deterred by the scent or they're just deterred because there's something new in their environment that they're not used to. And then once they realize it's nothing bad for them, they'll just kind of keep coming back. There are also those noise deterrents. They're cheap. They can be made with things on hands like wind chimes, flags, radios, whistles. Your voice even can be a noise deterrent. You can get really loud and yell at them if you see them in your area. But this can be a nuisance to neighbors, and there is that issue with habituation. And depending on the noisemaker that you choose to use, urban wildlife, they might treat that noise deterrent a little bit differently than their wild counterparts because they are used to many different sounds. I know urban deer, they're pretty used to getting honked at, or wind chimes in gardens and things like that. So sometimes they're not as effective to animals that are urbanized. So the first thing we need to do with any of these options are to fight habituation. And it's all about psychology. So habituation occurs when an animal becomes accustomed to a stimulus and no longer reacts to it. So for humans, it could be something like the refrigerator buzzing. If you notice it a lot right when you move into your new house, but then after a couple of days, you don't really notice it anymore. You're kind of getting habituated to that sound. You're no longer noticing it. You're no longer reacting to it. Same thing with the light flickering. It bothers you for a few days, and then after a while, you kind of get desensitized to it. And this is the same thing for all wildlife. If you're standing there and watching a coyote hang out in your neighborhood and we don't do anything about it, they're just going to recognize us and see us no longer as a threat and kind of get desensitized to us being there. Same with kind of all other wildlife. So with any of these tips, it's always important to mix it up and try all of them. Sprinkle a couple different ones in here and there and make sure to change it up because animals don't like change in their habitat. So by moving things around, changing the noise deterrents that you're using, that can be really helpful in kind of disrupting their habitat and making them feel really uncomfortable. Another option is to fence them out. And this is really my favorite option, especially when talking about little garden spaces, because it really does completely remove access to whatever is attracting them into that area. It can protect the plants from other animals, and once they're installed, they typically have minimal upkeep. Downfalls are they can be very costly depending on which ones you choose, as well as cumbersome. And it's probably not as cost effective to fence off a huge area, but little garden spaces can really benefit from fencing. So there are lots of different fencing options. Here's an awesome resource that we can throw in the chat at the end, but it goes over some deer and elk fencing options that they've found that works really well. But you can, of course, surround a whole garden with a woven wire or a solid 7-foot fence. It's best if the fencing is kind of fully enclosed so the deer can't see that lovely broccoli that you're trying to grow or the nice daffodils that have the nice, beautiful green leaves. You can also opt for something like electric fencing. This can be a lot less expensive, which is nice. And they even have movable options that you can put out, and at the end of the season or when you notice deer not being in the area anymore, you can kind of remove it. It's certainly not as long lasting as a solid fence, but they are quite nice and can be very cost effective and effective. And then of course you can individually place fencing around whatever you're trying to protect from deer grazing. So this right here is an example of an individually fenced off little garden space. This is a great option. You can open it up, still get to whatever you're trying to garden in, but it's going to keep out anything that might be trying to access that vegetation. This one uses chicken wire. I personally like sturdy woven wire better. It's going to keep up better, and it's a lot more sturdy than a chicken wire, because chicken wire was really created to keep things in and not necessarily keep things out. Same thing for if you're building a chicken coop, woven wire is the way to go. This is another great example of a raised bed garden if you're super into gardening like I am. Again, raised off of the ground, but it has this fencing that nothing can kind of get in and start to browse on that vegetation. Here is that tall 6-foot fence. Deer are really good at jumping, so they can jump this, but by having it kind of blocked off, you're trying to kind of cut down what they can see in the yard and kind of trying to deter them that way. I know in some areas like Old Carson City, this might not be an option because of the permitting process, and I think you can't have like closed off fences, but for people who are not in that area, this can be an effective tool. Again, there is that electric fencing, and this is just another example of some woven wire fencing. They really built it up, and you can see at the top there's even some wire so that nothing can kind of jump over that. Another option, if you're just trying to protect some of your nice plants that you have to just look at, is to choose deer resistant plants. There are lots of them out there, but native is seriously the best option you can have. There are lots of beautiful native plants that we have here in Nevada, and native plants are just going to be naturally a little bit more resistant to that browsing of deer. Here's another list of ones that you can also find that are deer resistant. Definitely not deer proof, but they'll hold up a little bit better to that browsing, like marigolds, heather, holly, hemlock, rose, redbuds, spruce, white pines, bee balm, catmint, lots of different options on there. And if you do notice someone actively feeding deer in your neighborhood, in Nevada, it is illegal to feed big game animals. So big game mammals include pronghorn antelope, black bear, mule deer, mountain goats, mountain lions, elk, and bighorn sheep. And intentionally feed means to supply, provide, or otherwise make available any salt, grain, meat, or other form of nourishment with the intent to attract or feed a big game mammal. So if you do see people intentionally putting out food, you can certainly contact us and let us know, and we'll see if we can get someone out there to stop that behavior, because we really don't want animals to become reliant on us for food. We want them to remain wild. And then I also have these really awesome resources available, and I can put these in the chat as well. But these are great if you're looking into electric fencing, you want some fact sheets on mule deer and urban deer, deer-friendly fences, as well as ways to garden with mule deer in the area. And I know that was super brief, but I wanted to leave some time for questions. So if we have any, we can jump into some of those.
All right, so it looks like we have one question.
Okay.
Someone's asking, so they have 10 acres of land and they're trying to start a farm. They want to know how tall their fence should be and what kind of material they might be looking at using. They want to fence in at least 1 to 2 acres.
Yeah, so it really depends on what you're trying to kind of protect and everything. I think maybe electric fencing would be a good option since you're trying to fence off a lot of space. I'm gonna get out of my presentation and I'm gonna throw these links into the chat right now. And some of them, let me see. There's a lot of good information in all of these, as well as this fencing one that I'll throw in here. So I suggest doing just a lot of research on all of those fencing options, but I would probably go with an electric fence if it were me.
We have someone else wondering if electric fencing is an issue for birds and insects.
I am not 100% sure. I think it depends on what electric fencing you're using. But honestly, electric fencing is a great option because it really does send a good message. We suggest it for deer, for bears, just about anything that you're trying to keep out. It's going to be effective for.
Our next question is shed hunting legal in Nevada?
It is, but there is a season. I don't have the season off the top of my head, but if you go to our website, that's on there. So you just have to do it within that season and follow those laws. But there's a whole page about it.
Someone's wondering if in the winter, when animals are stressed, if salt blocks and game blocks that help birds as well as big game are acceptable?
No, so if you're attracting really any big game, you can't put it out. They really don't need our help. They have lots of adaptations to deal with the winter time, like migrating. Mule deer migrate to find food elsewhere. So they really don't need our help, and you don't want to go down that road of attracting those deer into your spaces.
That is the last of our questions.
Perfect. Sounds good. Well, thank you everyone for joining me. I know it was brief, so I do apologize for that. But hopefully that means that you'll all get to dinner a little bit earlier, unless you're already eating. I know I'm ready for some food. So thank you so much. And during this time, please take some time, embrace the outdoors. It's beautiful out there. And if you need more information, that's my email, and I'm happy to send you those links if you're not able to copy them down right now.